I'm Mark Tallman with the Kansas Association of School Boards. One of the biggest issues in educational debates in Kansas is whether spending more money on K-12 education will lead to better results. Most school leaders certainly think so, and that's the reason the Kansas Supreme Court has said that funding is not adequate or suitable to provide the educational outcomes Kansas wants and has ordered the legislature to add more money. But many legislators and other organizations say we've added a lot of money to K-12 education and we really haven't seen positive results. We wanted to look at what the facts really are in this area and let you draw your conclusions. First, let's take a look at overall school funding in Kansas. As this chart shows, total school district funding in Kansas has certainly increased from 1990 to 2019, and in fact would have increased prior to that, as previous data would show. However, all of this increase really took place between 1990 and 2009. Since 2009, education funding has actually fallen behind inflation, recovering somewhat in 2018 and 2019 when the legislature began to respond to the Gannon School finance case. It's worth noting that the blue bars in this chart show total school district expenditures from all sources and for all purposes, and the orange-red bars are looking just at school district operating funds, basically their general fund, local option budget, and special education state aid. The difference has been increases in federal funding, school district capital improvement and debt programs, KPERS contributions, and other local revenues, such as student fees. So what's happened to educational outcomes over that time? Well, long-term educational outcomes in Kansas, looking at the entire Kansas population, show that we have had improvement. Again, if we go back to 1990 and compare this using national census data through 2016, we can see that overall high school completion in Kansas has increased from just over 80% to over 90%, and it's improved for every major subgroup. In other words, the new generation of students coming out of our schools are more educated than older generations of Kansans they replace. The same is true when you look at four-year degree completion. About a quarter of a century ago, about 21% of Kansans had a four-year college degree. In 2016, it was almost one-third. Once again, every major subgroup has also shown improvement over this period of time, in many cases significant. Black Kansans, for example, have more than doubled their four-year completion in the last roughly quarter century. And even if you look at the age group most closely coming out of our school system, age 18 to 24, we've seen considerable improvement as well. The total number of Kansans in this age group has increased, yet the number of young Kansans who have not finished high school has actually dropped compared to 2005, just 12 years ago. Those who have completed high school and nothing more has stayed about the same, but those who have started college or finished a 1 or 2 year degree, and those who've completed a bachelor's degree, a 4-year degree by age 24, have both increased significantly when compared to just 12 years ago. And this has had a significant impact on earnings within the state of Kansas, for the simple reason that the higher level of education a person has, the more on average they will earn at their job. KASB compared the current education levels and estimated earnings from government sources with what they would have been if we were still at 1990 levels of education. It's added about $6 billion a year worth of earnings, for the simple reason that there are fewer Kansans at the lower level and lower paying levels of education, and many more Kansans with higher degrees of education that earn more. Those are adult education standards. Let's look at what has happened when we measure students within the public school system. One way we can do this going back for a number of years is the National Assessment of Education Progress. This is a national test, and it only tests a small number of students in Kansas and other states. It's only given every 2 years, and it's only given, or at least reported, at grades 4 and 8 in the subjects of math and reading. If you average these 4 tests together, we can see that the percent of Kansas students who are showing they are at different levels of achievement on this test has improved compared to 2003, and that's the first year that all states were required to take this test, but has shown some slipping in recent years. In 2003, just under 74% of Kansas kids scored at the basic level. This might be considered sort of a minimum level, what you might consider just on expected grade level. By 2009, when funding had been increasing, that reached 80% and remained at that level in 2011. By 2017, it had dropped to 76%, still higher than it was in 2003, but not as good as it was before funding began to be reduced compared to inflation. Likewise, Kansas students at the proficient level, which might be thought of as better preparation for college or post-secondary education, was just under 36% in 2003, rose to over 38% in 2009 and 40% in 2011, but has dropped back to 38% in 2017. Next year, we'll get the results from 2019. We can also look at high school graduation rates, not those who've completed high school at any point, but those who've graduated within 4 years, on time, or with their class. This is what we call the adjusted cohort graduation rate. This chart shows that Kansas has consistently done better than the national average. The red line shows the Kansas graduation rate for all students. Starting in 2011, which was when we first began all states using the adjusted cohort graduation rate, Kansas rate increased from about 81% to 86% in 2013. Again, remember that funding was cut in 2009. This obviously did not have an immediate impact, but in 2011, basically improvement stopped until 2016, when improvement started again and continued in 2018, the first year of new funding under the school finance system passed several years ago. The solid blue line is the national average. Note that Kansas continues to be ahead, but the rest of the country is starting to catch up. We don't yet have 2018 data for the rest of the country. If you look at low-income Kansans only, we see a similar pattern. In 2011, about 71% of students eligible for free and reduced lunch were graduating on time. That increased to 76%, but slowed, increasing just to about 78% in 2016 before moving ahead a little faster in 2017. Again, we don't have data broken down for low-income students released yet from the federal government, but we know that the national low-income student graduation rate has caught up to Kansas. We'll have to see whether that trend continues as more information becomes available. Then we can also look at how students are prepared for college in Kansas and provide a comparison with the rest of the country. This table shows the percent of students who take the ACT College Readiness and score at the College Ready benchmark in all 4 areas: English, math, reading, and science. About 25% of Kansas students were at the benchmark in all 4 levels in 2006. That rose to a high of 32% in 2015 before dropping back in 2016 and 17 and remaining level in 2018. Nationally, the pattern is somewhat similar, but lower, rising from about 21% to about 28% in 2015 and dropping back. The concern, however, is that the national average has been slowly gaining on Kansas. Again, we'll have new data coming in the future. It's important to understand that most Kansas students test at College Ready at higher percentages in, for example, English, reading, math. It's a lower number that qualify in all 4 areas. We've seen how Kansas school funding has increased more than inflation between 1990 and 2009, but has actually fallen behind inflation since then. Now let's look at how funding compares to the total income of all Kansans. In other words, how is total funding compared to the overall resources people have to pay to support the system? This chart shows total Kansas K-12 funding as a percentage of the total income of all persons living in the state. As you can see, in 1990, it was over 4.5%. That stayed fairly level until the 2000s when it increased several years to around 5%. But since 2009, that percentage has been dropping. And in 2018 and 19, total funding is a smaller share of Kansas personal income than any year since 1990. And looking only at general fund, local option budget, and special education aid, the decline has been even steeper. Now, this, of course, is an average. It doesn't mean that every individual taxpayer is paying less, but it means that total funding as a share of total income has actually been declining for at least 10 to 15 years. So let's sum up. Kansas K-12 funding has grown more than inflation over the long term, but it's fallen behind inflation since 2009 and remains so even after increased funding the last 2 years. Kansas education levels have also increased over the long term, reaching all-time highs for all Kansans and every ethnic and minority group, and increasing incomes, because as people have higher levels of education, they tend to earn more on the job. National tests of basic and proficient skills, graduation rates, and college readiness are also all higher than their baselines when we began taking these measurements some years ago. However, each of those measures slowed or declined in recent years as funding fell behind inflation, although it took several years to have this impact. Educators would say this is because learning tends to become cumulative. You don't start doing worse immediately, but if there isn't educational supports in place, if there isn't the quality of education available, eventually we see declines. It's therefore reasonable to assume that higher education funding will promote higher educational results over time. This history has shown us that additional funding in Kansas has led to higher outcomes, and cuts in fundings have resulted in reductions in that improvement. But there's reasons we know this can be true without simply looking at history. More funding allows districts to have more ways to help students who are not reaching educational standards, such as early childhood programs and all-day kindergarten, special education services, and extra time to give students who are struggling more individual attention, after-school programs, summer school programs. It allows districts to hire more staff to provide these services, while keeping class sizes low for all students and providing more individual attention to students at school. We know that when funding has increased over the past decades, school districts have hired more people to provide these services. We know that when funding was cut, positions were cut. And the last 2 years, as funding has again been increased, districts have went out and hired more individuals to replace those lost or provide new services. Additional funding allows competitive salaries to attract and keep high-quality employees, and to provide professional development and in-service programs to help current employees do better. For example, the legislature is proposing increasing professional development to help teachers do a better job identifying and meeting the needs of students with dyslexia. Additional funding provides services to help keep students safe and healthy. The legislature has funded mental health services and provided grant funding for school safety. And we know that 3 different previous cost studies commissioned and funded by the legislature have all found a positive correlation between increased funding and increased student results. And we know from the examples of successful programs. The legislature, for example, has been looking at the Jobs for America's Graduates programs, which has a great track record of increasing graduation rates among students served. What often isn't talked about is this program provides significant additional funding to help these students. We hope this presentation has given you more information about education funding and results for Kansas schools. If you have additional questions, feel free to contact me at mtolman@kasb.org. Thanks for watching.